When you picture a medieval winter, you probably imagine something from a film. Stone castles blanketed in pristine snow. Villagers bundled in thick wool cloaks, gathering around enormous fires in the Great Hall. Perhaps a festive celebration, candles flickering against frost-kissed windows, mulled wine steaming in pewter cups. The cold seems picturesque, manageable, even romantic. That version exists only in our imagination. The actual experience of winter in medieval Europe bore almost no resemblance to these carefully crafted images. What we think of as winter, a season of discomfort perhaps, but one we endure with layers and heating, was something else entirely between the years 500 and 1500. It was a test of biological endurance, a grinding, months-long struggle against cold so penetrating it entered your bones and never quite left. A season when the margin between life and death narrowed to almost nothing. We've lost the ability to understand this kind of cold, not because we're softer or weaker, but because our entire relationship with temperature has been fundamentally altered. Central heating, insulation, waterproof materials, accessible nutrition, these aren't luxuries. They're the baseline of survival we've built our lives upon. Remove them and winter stops being an inconvenience. It becomes an existential threat. Medieval people knew this intimately. They planned their entire year around the coming cold. Harvest wasn't just about gathering food, it was about surviving until spring. Every decision made in summer and autumn carried the weight of winter behind it. How much grain to store, how much wood to collect, whether the thatch on the roof would hold, whether the animals would make it through, whether you would make it through. The cold didn't arrive gradually. Once autumn began to fade, the temperature dropped with a finality that modern heating systems have made us forget. By November, most of Europe was locked into conditions that would persist until March or April. 5 months, sometimes 6. The sun barely climbed above the horizon. Days shortened to a few pale hours of gray light. Nights stretched endlessly, and the structures people lived in offered almost no protection. Imagine the house you'd occupy if you were among the common people, which statistically you would be. Not a house, really. A single-room dwelling with walls made of wattle and daub, woven sticks packed with mud, dung, and straw. When it dried, it formed a crude barrier but never a seal. Wind moved through the gaps constantly. You'd feel it on your skin even inside. The roof was thatch, layered reeds or straw, sloped to shed rain. Effective against water, perhaps, but useless against cold. There were no windows in the way you understand them. Glass was impossibly expensive, reserved for churches and nobility. Your home might have a small opening covered with oiled cloth or thin animal membrane, something translucent enough to let in a little light, but nothing you could see through clearly. More often, there was simply a hole in the wall, shuttered with wood at night. Closing it meant choosing between freezing in darkness or freezing while being able to see your breath in the dim light. The floor was packed earth. In some regions, rushes or straw were scattered across it for insulation, but this created its own problems. The organic matter decomposed slowly, mixing with mud, food scraps, and waste. It became damp, cold, a breeding ground for parasites and disease. You'd sleep on this floor or on a simple wooden platform raised just inches above it with perhaps a thin straw mattress beneath you. Your fire, the only source of heat, sat in the center of the room, often just a shallow pit lined with stones. There was no chimney. Smoke rose toward a hole in the roof, but much of it lingered inside, filling the space with a constant haze. Your eyes would water, your throat would burn. Everything you owned, your clothes, your blankets, your skin, would smell permanently of smoke. But you couldn't let the fire die. Not ever. Because once the embers went cold, restarting it was a serious undertaking. Flint and steel, tinder that had to be kept dry, patience, and luck. Keeping the fire burning meant keeping yourself alive. But it was never enough. The heat didn't radiate far. A few feet from the flames, the temperature dropped sharply. The walls offered no insulation. The ceiling trapped smoke, not warmth. You'd position yourself as close to the fire as possible, but your front would be uncomfortably hot while your back remained frozen. Move away even slightly and the cold reclaimed you. At night, the fire was dampened to conserve wood. You'd bury yourself under whatever coverings you owned. Wool blankets if you were fortunate, animal hides, layers of old clothing. You'd sleep fully dressed, often sharing body heat with family members. Livestock occasionally kept inside for warmth. But the cold still found you. It seeped up from the ground. It doctor ifted down from the roof. It entered through every crack and gap in the walls. You'd wake repeatedly, shivering, breath misting in the darkness. Your fingers and toes would ache with cold. Your nose would run. Your joints would stiffen. And this wasn't an occasional bad night. This was every night for months. Mornings were brutal. The fire had diminished to embers. The temperature inside the house was barely distinguishable from outside. You'd need to rebuild the fire before anything else could happen, before you could eat, before you could function. Your hands, stiff and clumsy with cold, would struggle with the task. The wood you'd collected weeks ago would be damp, slow to catch. The smoke would be worse in the early morning, thick and choking. And once the fire was going, once you'd absorbed enough heat to stop shivering, you'd face the next impossibility, stepping outside. The world beyond your door wasn't just cold. It was hostile in ways that are difficult to fully grasp now. The medieval European winter was colder than most winters we experience today, particularly during periods historians call the medieval warm period's decline and the early stages of the Little Ice Age. Rivers froze solid. Lakes became roads. Snow accumulated in drifts that reshaped the landscape entirely. But the cold itself was only the beginning. What made winter truly dangerous was the combination of temperature, moisture, and the complete absence of modern materials. Your clothing was wool. If you were fortunate, you had linen underneath. Wool was the only fabric widely available that retained some warmth even when damp, which was important because it was always damp. You'd sweat beneath the layers during any physical exertion. Snow would melt against the fabric. Rain would soak through. And there was no way to fully dry anything. You'd hang wet garments near the fire, but the moisture would evaporate slowly, incompletely. You'd put them back on still damp because you had no alternative. No second set. No backup. Wet wool against your skin in freezing temperatures created a bone-deep cold that modern technical fabrics have made obsolete. The moisture conducted heat away from your body faster than the wool could insulate. You'd feel simultaneously clammy and frozen. Your core temperature would drop slowly, persistently, every day. Not enough to kill you immediately, just enough to weaken you, to make you more susceptible to illness, to make every task harder. Your feet were wrapped in cloth or cheap leather if you owned any shoes at all. Many people didn't. They'd wrap their feet in rags or simply endure the cold. The ground was frozen solid, covered in ice and snow. Walking was treacherous. Your feet would go numb within minutes. Chilblains would form, painful swelling and lesions caused by repeated exposure to cold. Your toes would crack and bleed. Frostbite was common. People lost digits, sometimes entire feet, not from a single catastrophic exposure but from the accumulated damage of daily life. And you couldn't stay inside. There was work to be done. Animals needed tending. Livestock was your wealth, your food supply, your insurance against disaster. Cows, pigs, sheep, chickens, they had to be fed even when there was barely enough food for humans. You'd break ice on water troughs daily. You'd carry feed from storage. You'd check for illness, for injury, for problems that could cost you everything. The barn offered only marginally better protection than your house. Animals huddled together for warmth. Some would die anyway. You'd wake to find a pig frozen, a chicken dead, and you'd have no choice but to butcher it immediately before the meat spoiled. Or freeze. Wood collection was constant. The fire consumed wood at a rate that's hard to appreciate until you've maintained one continuously. You'd burn through a staggering amount every week, and all of it had to be gathered, chopped, and stored. But winter wood was problematic. Dead trees, fallen branches. Much of it was damp or rotten. It would smoke heavily and provide less heat. You'd have collected the best wood earlier in the year, but supplies dwindled. By midwinter, you'd be burning whatever you could find, walking farther each day into frozen forests to gather enough for survival. Chopping wood in freezing temperatures was brutal labor. Your hands would cramp around the axe handle. Your sweat would freeze against your skin. Your breath would come in ragged gasps of frigid air that burned your lungs. Stop moving, even for a moment, and the cold would overtake you. You'd learn to work in a state of controlled urgency, not because you were rushed, but because stillness was dangerous. Food was the third pillar of survival, and by midwinter, it was already becoming a problem. You'd stored everything you could months ago. Grain in sacks kept dry if you were lucky. Salted meat hanging in the coldest part of the house. Root vegetables buried in pits outside, insulated by earth. Dried bee. Ian's preserved fish, but all of it was finite. You'd ration carefully, but there was never enough. Your diet would narrow to almost nothing. Bread if you had grain. Pottage, a thin soup made from whatever vegetables remained, boiled with scraps of meat or bone. You'd eat the same thing every day. The monotony was oppressive, but worse was the hunger. The constant, gnawing awareness that you were slowly depleting your reserves. That spring was still months away. That if you ran out early, there was nowhere to turn. Hunger made the cold worse. Your body burned calories simply trying to stay warm, and with reduced food intake, you had less fuel. You'd feel colder, weaker, more susceptible to everything. Children suffered most. Their smaller bodies couldn't regulate temperature as effectively. They'd cry from hunger and cold, and there was nothing you could do except hold them close to the fire and hope. The wealthy, of course, experienced winter differently. In castles and manor houses, there were fireplaces built into stone walls, chimneys that vented smoke outside. Multiple rooms meant you could retreat to the warmest spaces. Tapestries hung on walls for insulation. Glass windows kept out wind while allowing light. And most importantly, there were vast stores of food. Salted meat, spices to make it palatable, wine, bread made from fine flour. The nobility didn't face the daily calculus of survival that defined winter for everyone else. But even wealth couldn't eliminate the cold entirely. Stone buildings were thermal nightmares. They absorbed cold and held it. Bedchambers were frigid. People slept in heavy canopied beds, the fabric creating a small, slightly warmer pocket of air. They wore nightcaps and layers even under blankets. Servants kept fires burning through the night, but the heat never reached far. You'd dress in the morning in a room so cold your breath misted, standing as close to the fire as possible while layers were added. The contrast wasn't lost on anyone. Peasants knew what warmth and plenty looked like. They served it, cleaned up after it, made it possible. They watched nobles feast while they rationed. They watched children of the wealthy thrive while their own weakened. Winter made inequality visceral. It wasn't abstract. It was the difference between eating and starving, between warmth and freezing, between life and death. By January, the psychological weight of winter began to match the physical. The initial shock of cold had passed. Now came the long, grinding realization that this would continue for months, that there was no escape, no reprieve, just day after day of the same brutal routine, with resources slowly diminishing and spring still impossibly distant. Time moved differently. Without modern entertainment, without books for most people, without anywhere to go, the days blurred together. Dawn came late. You'd wake in darkness, rebuild the fire, eat something meager, then face the question of how to fill the hours. Work helped. It provided purpose, warmth through movement, distraction, but there were limits. You couldn't chop wood all day. You couldn't tend animals continuously. Long stretches of time had to be endured inside, sitting near the fire, doing almost nothing. Some households had handwork. Women would spin wool, mend clothes, prepare food. Men might carve wood, repair tools, weave baskets. These tasks were meditative but also maddening in their repetition. Hour after hour of the same movements, smoke stinging your eyes, cold pressing in from all sides whenever you moved away from the fire. Children grew restless and fractious, tempers short. The close quarters that had seemed necessary for warmth began to feel suffocating. Illness arrived with a grim inevitability. Respiratory infections spread easily in smoke-filled, poorly ventilated homes where multiple people lived in constant proximity. A cough would start with one person and move through the family within days. What began as a minor cold could escalate rapidly. Pneumonia killed swiftly, especially in children and the elderly. Bodies weakened by cold and hunger had no reserves to fight infection. There was no medicine as we understand it. Herbal remedies existed: willow bark for pain, honey for coughs, poultices for wounds. But their effectiveness was limited. Most people turned to prayer and hope. Illness was understood through the framework of humoral theory, the belief that health depended on balancing four bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Treatments focused on restoring balance through bleeding, purging, or dietary changes, none of which actually addressed the underlying infections. Watching someone sicken in winter was helpless agony. You'd see the fever rise, feel the heat radiating from their skin even as they shivered violently. You'd hear the wet, rattling cough that signaled fluid in the lungs. You'd try to keep them warm, close to the fire, forcing them to drink water or thin broth. But often it wasn't enough. Death came quietly, usually at night, the person's breathing growing shallower until it simply stopped. Burial in winter was its own ordeal. The ground was frozen solid, sometimes to depths of several feet. Digging a grave required pickaxes and enormous effort. In some regions, bodies were kept in unheated outbuildings until spring thaw made burial possible. In others, the community would gather to break through the frozen earth, working together in the bitter cold to lay their dead to rest. Funerals were brief. There was no lingering outside in those temperatures. Words were said quickly, and people returned to their homes, carrying the grief with them into the darkness. The church offered the only organized support system during these months, and its role went far beyond spiritual comfort. Monasteries and churches maintained grain stores that could be distributed during severe shortages. Priests organized communal aid, ensuring that the most vulnerable, widows, orphans, the elderly, received help. Religious feast days provided psychological markers, breaking up the monotonous stretch of winter with moments of ritual and community gathering. But the church's explanations for suffering were double-edged. Hardship was framed as divine will, a test of faith or punishment for sin. This provided some people with meaning, a way to contextualize their suffering within a larger cosmic order. For others, it added a layer of guilt and despair. If your child died, if your livestock froze, if your stored food spoiled, was it because you'd failed morally? Because God was displeased? The theology of suffering was complex and deeply personal, offering comfort and torment in equal measure. Saints associated with winter, agriculture, and health became focal points of devotion. Saint Martin, whose feast day marked the beginning of winter, was invoked for protection. Saint Blaise, protector against throat ailments, was especially important during the season of respiratory illness. People would gather for blessings, small rituals that provided a sense of agency in an otherwise uncontrollable situation. Yet religion couldn't alter material reality. Faith didn't fill empty stomachs or warm, frozen bodies. The daily struggle remained. And as winter deepened, as food stores continued to shrink, the anxiety became almost unbearable. By February, many households were in crisis. The optimistic rationing of November had given way to desperate scarcity. Meals became smaller, less frequent. Bread was stretched with additives, ground peas, bark, anything to add bulk. Meat was a distant memory. The pottage grew thinner, more water than substance. People began to look gaunt, their faces hollow, their movements slower. Hunger does strange things to the mind. It creates an obsessive focus on food. Every conversation circles back to it. Dreams are filled with feasts that dissolve upon waking. The body begins to consume itself, breaking down muscle for energy. Strength wanes. Tasks that were difficult become nearly impossible. Chopping wood takes twice as long. Walking to the well feels like a major expedition. The cold feels worse because you have less internal heat to generate. Children suffered visibly. Their growth stunted. Their bellies distended from malnutrition. They cried less as their energy faded. They'd lie near the fire, listless and quiet, their eyes too large in their thin faces. Parents made impossible choices. Who gets the last piece of bread? How much do you eat yourself to maintain strength for work versus feeding the children? There were no good answers. Some families resorted to desperate measures. They'd slaughter animals they'd hoped to keep for breeding, knowing it solved the immediate problem while creating a larger one for next year. They'd borrow grain from neighbors, going into debt they might never repay. In the worst cases, people ate things they normally wouldn't: spoiled food, animal feed, even substances that made them sick. Survival overrode every other consideration. The wealthy, meanwhile, continued their relative comfort. Wine flowed in manor halls. There were still courses at dinner, still variety. The contrast wasn't malicious, it was simply structural. The entire economic system was designed to flow resources upward. Peasants produced, lords consumed. Winter made this brutally clear. March arrived without the relief it seemed to promise. Technically, spring was beginning. The calendar said so. The church recognized it. But the weather paid no attention. Snow continued. Temperatures remained brutal. The hope that had sustained people through February, just one more month, just hold on a little longer, began to feel like a cruel joke. This late winter period was often the deadliest. Stores were exhausted. Bodies were weakened by months of inadequate nutrition and constant cold. Immune systems were compromised. People who'd survived since November would succumb now, not to a dramatic freeze or catastrophic event, but to the accumulated wear of endurance. Elderly people were especially vulnerable. Their bodies couldn't generate heat as effectively. They'd sit closest to the fire all day, barely moving, wrapped in whatever blankets the household could spare. They'd eat less voluntarily, trying to preserve food for younger family members. Their hands would shake. Their voices would weaken. They'd slip away quietly, often in sleep, sometimes with what looked almost like relief. They'd fought long enough. Very young children faced similar odds. Infants born in autumn or early winter had the worst chances. Their tiny bodies burned calories rapidly, just maintaining core temperature. They needed more food relative to their size, but there was no more food. They'd stop gaining weight, then begin to lose it. They'd become eerily still, too weak to cry properly. Mothers would hold them continuously, sharing body heat, trying to will life into them through proximity. Sometimes it worked. Often it didn't. The slow dying of winter was different from the dramatic deaths of war or plague. There were no sudden battles, no visible enemies, just a gradual dimming. People grew quieter, moved less, slept more. The body's systems began failing in sequence. Circulation became poor, extremities perpetually cold. Healing slowed, small cuts refused to close. Thinking became fuzzy, decisions harder. This wasn't recognized as hypothermia or malnutrition in medieval terms. It was simply the way winter ended people. Communities developed unspoken triage. Families prioritized working-age adults because survival of the household depended on their labor. Children came next, as future stability. The elderly and chronically ill were cared for but understood to be most expendable in truly desperate situations. This sounds harsh by modern standards, but it wasn't cruelty. It was mathematics. The brutal calculus of survival when resources are absolute rather than scarce. Villages that had seemed cohesive in autumn became tense by late winter. Accusations flew. Someone's grain store seemed larger than it should be. Had they hoarded? Had they stolen? Neighbors who'd shared resources earlier now guarded their remaining supplies jealously. Doors stayed barred. Trust eroded under the pressure of prolonged scarcity. Yet extraordinary kindness also emerged. Families with even a little extra would share with those who had nothing. Not openly, to avoid appearing to have surplus, but quietly. A sack of grain left anonymously. A joint of salted meat. Acts of generosity that might mean the difference between life and death for the recipients. These weren't grand gestures. They were small, silent acknowledgments of shared humanity in the face of suffering. Women bore particular burdens during these months. They managed the household's food supplies, making the daily decisions about who ate what and how much. They prepared the meals, such as they were, trying to make thin gruel seem like something more. They nursed the sick with no tools except patience and care. They comforted frightened children. They maintained some semblance of routine and normality when everything felt precarious. And they did all this while often being pregnant or nursing infants. Medieval women spent much of their adult lives in some stage of pregnancy. The physical toll was enormous. Growing a baby requires substantial calories and nutrients, and there were none to spare. Miscarriages were common, especially during the hardest months. Women would bleed, cramping and grieving, with no medical support and no respite from daily labor. Childbirth in winter was especially dangerous. The mother needed extra warmth and nutrition during recovery, neither of which was reliably available. Newborns needed constant temperature regulation. The risk of infection was high in cold, unsanitary conditions. Many women died. Many babies died. It was so common that people spoke of it matter-of-factly, the way we might discuss a difficult commute. Not because they didn't care, but because grief had to be functional. You couldn't afford to be paralyzed by loss when survival required constant effort. Men faced their own trials. The physical labor of winter fell heavily on them. Chopping wood, repairing damage from storms, tending livestock in brutal conditions. Their hands would crack and bleed from the cold. Their backs would ache from constant exertion. They'd push through exhaustion because stopping wasn't an option. The household depended on them. Their identity was bound up in the ability to provide and protect, even when circumstances made that nearly impossible. Younger men sometimes took desperate measures. They'd leave home in search of work, traveling to towns where they hoped to find opportunities. Winter travel was extraordinarily dangerous. Roads disappeared under snow. Landmarks became unrecognizable. Travelers could freeze to death within sight of shelter if they became disoriented in a storm. Man, why who left never returned? Whether they died on the road, found new lives elsewhere, or simply gave up hope, their families never knew. The urban poor faced different but equally severe challenges. Cities offered some advantages: proximity to markets, charitable institutions, greater population density that could provide help in crisis. But they also concentrated misery. Fuel was expensive in towns. Food prices were higher. Housing was cramped and barely weatherproofed. Beggars lined the streets, many of them rural refugees who'd fled their villages hoping for better odds in the city. Urban death rates spiked in winter. Bodies were collected each morning, frozen in doorways and alleyways where people had sought shelter and not survived the night. Churches and monasteries distributed what they could: bread, soup, sometimes temporary shelter. But demand always exceeded supply. The fortunate received help. The rest were left to their own resources, which often meant they had none. By the time April arrived, those who'd survived were changed in ways both visible and invisible. Bodies were thinner, weaker. Faces looked older. There was a hardness around the eyes, the look of people who'd endured something difficult and weren't sure they could do it again. But spring, when it finally came, felt miraculous. The first signs were subtle: a slight warming in the air, snow melting into mud, icicles dripping in midday sun. These small shifts created disproportionate joy. People would stand outside, faces tilted toward the pale sun, absorbing the first real warmth in months. The psychological relief was immediate. Winter hadn't broken them. They'd made it through. Food remained critically scarce. The stored grain was gone. The preserved meat was gone. Everything was gone, but now there were alternatives. Early spring plants began appearing: nettles, dandelions, wild garlic. People foraged obsessively, gathering anything edible. These greens were bitter and tough, but they were fresh. They provided nutrients that had been absent for months. You could actually feel your body responding, gaining small amounts of strength. This period was called the hungry gap, the weeks between winter's end and the first harvests. It was often as dangerous as winter itself. People were weakened and vulnerable. They'd pushed themselves too hard, eager to plant crops and resume normal activity, and their bodies would fail. Heart attacks and strokes were common. The stress of prolonged hardship combined with sudden physical exertion created a deadly combination. Fields needed planting immediately. The entire year's survival depended on getting crops into the ground as soon as the soil could be worked. But the earth was muddy, heavy, difficult to till. Oxen were weak if they'd survived at all. Seed grain was precious. Every kernel planted was one less to eat now. People worked in a state of anxious urgency, racing against the calendar, knowing that late planting meant smaller harvests, which meant next winter would be even harder. Livestock that had survived emerged skeletal and weak. Cows had stopped producing milk. Chickens had stopped laying eggs. They needed time to recover, but there was no abundant food to help them. They'd be turned out to pasture to forage what they could, and slowly, hopefully, they'd regain strength. Some wouldn't. They'd simply collapse and die, their bodies too damaged by months of deprivation to recover. The social fabric of communities also needed repair. Tensions that had built over winter had to be addressed. Debts had to be negotiated. Arguments had to be resolved or at least set aside so planting could proceed. There was a collective understanding that summer work required cooperation, and most grudges were quietly buried under the pressure of necessity. Religious observance intensified with spring. Easter, the central feast of the Christian calendar, fell during this period. It represented resurrection, renewal, hope, themes that resonated powerfully with people who just survived winter's death grip. Churches would be full, packed with families giving thanks for survival. The liturgy spoke of darkness and light, suffering and redemption, metaphors that weren't abstract but deeply, personally felt. For those who'd lost family members during winter, spring brought complicated emotions. Relief at their own survival mixed with guilt and grief. Empty places at the table, absent voices. The busyness of planting provided distraction but also highlighted the loss. Work that had been shared was now borne by fewer hands. The absence was constant. Slowly, over weeks, life normalized. The temperature rose, days lengthened. Green appeared everywhere, transforming the gray-brown deadness of winter into something alive and growing. The first flowers bloomed. Birds returned from wherever they'd gone. The world felt reborn, and in a real sense, so did the people. But the memory of winter stayed. It informed every decision through summer and how much grain to store, how much wood to collect, how much preparation was enough. Because everyone knew with absolute certainty that winter would come again. It always did. And next time might be worse. This cycle defined medieval life in Northern and Central Europe in ways we struggle to comprehend. Our winters are inconveniences. Theirs were existential tests. The fact that people endured this year after year, generation after generation, reveals something profound about human resilience and adaptation. We've removed ourselves from these conditions so completely that they seem almost fictional. The idea of being cold for months, of genuine hunger, of watching winter systematically dismantle everything you've built, it exists for us only in imagination. We can read about it, consider it intellectually, but we can't really feel it. Our bodies don't know that kind of cold. Our minds don't carry that kind of sustained fear. Medieval people lived with the knowledge that winter was always coming. It shaped how they thought about time, about resources, about community. It made survival a collective project rather than an individual one. No one made it through winter alone. You needed family, neighbors, shared labor, shared resources. The social bonds weren't primarily about affection or choice. They were about survival. You helped others because one day you'd need help. You shared because refusal meant both of you might die. This created a particular kind of community, intensely interdependent, hierarchical, and often harsh by our standards, but also capable of extraordinary mutual support. People knew each other's vulnerabilities intimately. They knew who was strong and who was struggling. They knew which households were stable and which were on the edge. And they acted on that knowledge, sometimes selfishly, often generously, always pragmatically. The wealthy existed in a parallel reality, their winters difficult but never deadly. This wasn't accidental. The entire feudal system was designed to concentrate resources at the top, ensuring that lords and clergy could weather any crisis while peasants bore the full weight of hardship. Medieval inequality wasn't just about comfort versus discomfort. It was about survival versus death. The poor knew this. They saw it every winter, and they endured it because the alternative, rebellion, resistance, carried even greater risks. What medieval winter reveals, ultimately, is how thin the line between life and death once was. How much of what we consider normal existence depends on systems we take for granted. Heat at the touch of a dial, food available year-round, medical care when we're sick, shelter that actually protects us from the elements. Remove those things, and you're not experiencing adventure or rustic charm. You're fighting for survival against an indifferent natural world that doesn't care whether you live or die. Medieval people understood this in their bones. They knew that winter tested them not because of any moral failing or lack of effort, but simply because being human in Northern Europe, before modern technology, meant facing months of conditions that pushed the body to its limits. The remarkable thing isn't that people sometimes died. It's that most survived, that they found ways to endure circumstances we'd consider unendurable, that they maintained families, communities, culture, and faith through periods of grinding hardship, that they planted in spring knowing winter would return, and they'd have to do it all again. This wasn't heroism in the dramatic sense. It was the quiet, unglamorous heroism of persistence, of waking up in the frozen darkness and rebuilding the fire, of rationing food carefully when every instinct screams to eat more, of comforting your children when you're barely managing your own fear, of continuing when there's no guarantee of success, only the certainty that stopping means death. Modern life has given us remarkable gifts. We've solved problems that once seemed unsolvable. We've made winter into something manageable, even pleasant. We've removed the constant pressure of survival that defined existence for most of human history. This is genuinely wonderful. It's progress we should celebrate. But it's also created a kind of amnesia. We've forgotten what our ancestors knew, that comfort is fragile, that the systems protecting us from nature's harshness are recent inventions, that cold, hunger, and hardship are not distant historical abstractions, but conditions that remain possible if the infrastructure we depend on fails. Medieval people would find our world astonishing. The abundance of food, the reliable warmth, the fact that winter is now a season for holidays and recreation rather than survival. They'd marvel at how soft our lives have become, and they wouldn't mean it critically. They'd recognize that we've achieved what they could only dream of, security against the elements. Yet they might also notice what we've lost, the deep interdependence that made communities more than just groups of individuals living near each other. The understanding of seasons as profound cycles rather than minor variations in weather. The knowledge that survival requires planning, patience, and mutual support. These weren't just practical skills. They were ways of being in the world, of understanding your place in relation to others and to nature. We don't need those skills anymore, mostly. Our survival doesn't depend on community grain stores or knowing which wild plants are edible in early spring. We can live independently in ways medieval people couldn't imagine, but something has been traded away in the process. Some kind of connection to elemental reality. Some understanding of how precarious human life actually is when stripped of its technological protections. The history of medieval winter isn't really about the past. It's about perspective. It's about understanding that the baseline of human experience isn't the comfort we now inhabit but the struggle our ancestors endured. That what seems normal to us, warmth, food, security, is actually extraordinary, recent, fragile. Medieval people weren't different from us in any fundamental way. They weren't stronger or tougher or more capable of endurance by nature. They simply had no choice. Winter came whether they were ready or not. They adapted because the alternative was death. They developed knowledge, techniques, and social structures that maximized their chances of survival. And they passed those to the next generation, who refined them further. This accumulated wisdom is largely lost to us now. We don't know how to live without electricity, running water, central heating. We don't know which plants to forage, how to preserve meat without refrigeration, how to start a fire without matches. We've outsourced survival to systems we don't understand and couldn't replicate. This makes us simultaneously more capable. We can accomplish things medieval people couldn't imagine, and more vulnerable. If those systems fail, we're helpless in ways they never were. None of this is a call to return to medieval conditions. No one should romanticize that suffering. It was brutal, unfair, and unnecessary given our current capabilities. The fact that we've eliminated winter as an existential threat is an achievement we should protect and extend to everyone still facing those conditions. But remembering how it was, really understanding the daily texture of medieval winter provides something valuable. Gratitude for what we have, respect for those who survived with so much less, and perhaps a little humility about our own resilience. We haven't been tested the way they were. We don't know if we'd endure as well. We'd like to think so, but we can't be sure. The people who lived through medieval winters left no dramatic testimony. Most couldn't write. Their experiences wear in.